So we'll just visit for a few minutes while people jump on Facebook Live. I'm going to follow the Facebook Live here on my phone, and so that I can kind of watch how many people are jumping on. And I'm going to encourage people to make comments here in just a minute. So if you've already jumped on live on Facebook, welcome. I'll do an official welcome, a more detailed welcome here in about 1 or 2 minutes. So Chris, how are things going over there at church during this COVID crisis? Hey, Chris, you there?
Chris Cunningham, is it Chris Cunningham?
Chris Cunningham. Sorry, I better make that clear today. Chris Cunningham, how's things going at the COVID crisis?
Things are going okay. I am more of an introvert, so staying home is not very difficult for me. It is almost like this is my normal, and then I have to push myself to get out of the normal. So it's working okay.
Chris Stepp, how's things going up in Roanoke?
I think overall we are doing really well in doing our best to stay connected, and we have incredible leaders here at GCC that really step up to the plate and do a phenomenal job keeping people together and keeping people tied together. So yeah, doing well. Yeah.
We still got Juan on there.
I'm
Hey,
here.
Juan, still there? How are things at Nueva Vida?
Things are going well, and we're hoping to just continue doing what we're doing for a couple more weeks. And we're talking about reopening to 50% capacity, but things have been going well.
Awesome. Well, it's 12 o'clock sharp, and we already have about 100 people online. So for the first 100 that are online that are tuning into the Tuesday noontime prayer, we are going to have prayer today, but it's going to be at the end of an important discussion. And I think we called this discussion today, Run with Ahmaud, a Biblical Response. And what we'd like to do is to shape our intercession and worship around a discussion of the tragedy of this young man that lost his life. He was killed in Georgia back in February, I believe it was. And, you know, if you're following social media or you're watching the news, you can't help but see some of the recent things that have transpired. And I heard somebody say, interestingly enough, it says it wasn't that the police found a video of the shooting. It was that the family found the video. And it says a lot about the order of events that have led up to where we're at today. And I think it's worthy for a good discussion. So I got about 140 of us online now. And so let me introduce New Life and those that are joining from other One Focus Church. Let me introduce real quickly who we got here. First of all, I want to introduce Dana. She's the prettiest one on the panel and a tremendous pastor. Very, very articulate and very thoughtful. And so, Dana, why don't you give a 15-second shout out?
Well, thanks first of all for Pastor Dan for just inviting me to be on the panel. It's such an honor for me. This is such a topic that I'm really passionate about: racial reconciliation, racial justice. And so I've been pastoring at New Life for a whole 1 year. I've been on staff for several years and at the church, and New Life is a great church to be a part of. I think our multi-ethnicity puts us in such a position to really be able to speak from a place of wisdom and a place of prophetic place. So I'm looking forward to what we're going to do today.
Awesome. And next is Chris Stepp. Chris pastors in a Grace Church up in Roanoke, Virginia, probably the prettiest town in Virginia. And he pastors a dynamic church there. And he's a part of the network, a rising voice, and just a community pastor. So Chris, do a shout out.
Well, thanks. Like Dana said, thanks for including us in this conversation, including me. I am honored to join you all today. We absolutely love being a part of this network of churches and the diversity, the multi-ethnic churches. We're trying to grow a multi-ethnic church here in Roanoke, Virginia, which is an incredibly diverse city. And along with that comes these type of conversations. And so we're just grateful to be part of this today. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, man. Chris Cunningham is not a stranger to some of you. Chris is Dr. Chris is a well-known pastor in our Community Pastors Go Church in Virginia Beach, an international church that just merged with another church. He's a very strong leader and thinker, writer. So Chris, I want you to greet everybody.
Hello, beautiful people. It's a joy to be here. Pastor Dan, thanks again for the invitation. One of the things that many people might not know is that Go Church was planted by New Life. And the important part of this is that we had and we still have the DNA of New Life, which is the multi-ethnicity. And so over the last 9 years, we just celebrated our 9th anniversary. Over the last 9 years, we have had the joy of working with people from different races, different cultures. And in January, we merged with a predominantly white church. And so the balance has actually shifted where in Go Church, Global Outreach Church, we now have more whites than blacks, which is strange for a black pastor.
Yeah, Chris, watch those white people. Lock up everything.
You
Now
taught
we
me
have
well, so we're taking care.
And now we have Juan Mila, church with many first-generation Americans, and he's a counselor by profession, bivocational, tremendous pastor. I know he's spoken at Chris Stubbs Church. He's been at One Focus events, and so Chris, why don't you greet everybody?
Hola, ¿cómo están? That will be the extent of Spanish that I'll use, okay? Otherwise, you guys will be lost. Again, I want to echo what everybody said. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I don't take this lightly. I have really no expertise when it comes down to race in America. So just the fact that you would consider me to be part of this, I appreciate it. And thank you again.
You're welcome, Juan. And finally, a late addition to this panel is David McBride. And I've known David many years. There's no finer man that I know than David McBride. He pastors a multi-ethnic campus, beloved by everybody that's in that campus. And David has a rich heritage in racial reconciliation. His brothers, mother and father, he's from California. We won't hold that against him. And he's brings a perspective that is much needed. So David, I'm going to throw it to you. And David, I want you to make some preliminary remarks. And I want you to answer the question, how did you feel when you first found out about the initial killing? And then as the video came out and this narrative has begun to take shape, how did you feel as a African-American and as a pastor, and how do those two interface? And then I'll ask the rest of the panel the same question, their initial feelings, and then we'll go on to some other things.
Well, thanks, Pastor, for having me here. I am so grateful for our church and for the role we're taking. I mean, it's hard to be able to articulate for everyone in the African American community, but I think just my own personal feelings when I found out about the shooting and the video. One of our former pastors, Mike Harris, shared it, and kind of got me into the conversation. And I honestly, normally, there's been times where I've been afraid when these have happened in the past. There's been other times where I've been, all other sorts of emotions. This time I was just tired, and I just had this sense of weariness and was tired of these things that just continuously happening. I was tired of the conversations that we were going to tired of just tired, tired of these things continuously happening to the African American community. And my weariness um, weighed on me to the point that I didn't really want to post about anything, didn't want to have any sort of a public reaction, but I knew that I had to. And so I was balancing the idea of my role as a leader at a multi-ethnic church, but in just my role as a Black man, and trying to process through that a little bit. And so it took me about a day or so after I found out about the shooting to actually post. Some of that was my weariness. Some of that was just I have 3 kids at home, and so I was trying to figure out a time to get to my computer and actually write something down that made some sense. And so that morning during my prayer time, I felt the Lord just speak to my heart, and I typed a little something. Pastor Kevin Trimper, who's a pastor at Crossroads Church here in Norfolk, also posted something that kind of helped me articulate my words a little bit. And the weariness was just something that I had to deal with, but not let the weariness produce silence, and not let the weariness produce a lack of reaction and not willing to engage. I kept hearing the Lord speak to my heart and say, stay in the fight. Stay in the fight against evil, stay in the fight against racism, stay in the fight against misunderstandings. Just stay in there. And I think for me, dealing with my own emotions was really hard to deal with. And thankfully, I've had a great church, a great pastoral staff, Pastor Dan, Pastor Kevin, who are there to support and bring strength. But this one was harder, Pastor, than the others. My brother Michael McBride is a national voice to these issues, and he said the statement that this is a compounded trauma for us, because we're not just dealing with this incident, but we're also dealing with this virus, COVID situation, and that is compounding the trauma. And I found myself already being tired, and this made me feel overwhelmed. And so hearing the voices of my other white brothers and sisters who came up and voiced their concern and voiced their sorrow over the situation strengthened me. And then talking to some other campus pastor friends, they were New Life, and other pastor friends in the city of Norfolk strengthened me as well. So that was a kind of the some reactions, but it was a trying time, definitely.
Of African American, 2 sons, and you have 2 daughters too. Is it 4?
You talking to me?
No, I'm talking to Dana. Dana, you have 4 kids. Hello, Dana.
Yes, I have 4 kids. I have 3 sons and a daughter.
Okay, 3 sons and a daughter, and they're athletes. And so something like this, I know, strikes closer to home to you. What was your initial feeling? Maybe not processed through theology, but just as a mother, a Black woman raising sons in the South. What were you thinking?
Well, we live in a predominantly white neighborhood, and my kids go for runs all the time. And so it just really struck me as this could really happen to any of us. This, unfortunately is not an isolated incident. I feel like we keep seeing these stories in the news. I was talking to a friend last night and I said, this is just the newest one. There'll be another one. There'll be another one. And so there's this sense of, when is this ever going to stop? Like, when will people get it? And then having conversations with my very young sons. My little boys are 11 and 13. And having to have these conversations with them much earlier than I would have wanted to have these conversations with them. But my husband and I have to sit down and we have to tell them, how to act when they're in public. You can't necessarily do the same things that some of your white friends can do. I have a 21-year-old son. And so, he's driving down the road fully tatted up. And, so that always just makes me think, if he gets pulled over, could he have a similar situation? So yeah, it definitely hits close to home.
Chris, you've lived in the States 20 years, Chris Cunningham, or longer. And I saw you post a little bit on Facebook. Chris, what was your initial thoughts?
I let out an audible gasp because it was as if I was feeling the bullets in me again. Because what has happened is that being in America, being a Black person, you don't get a chance to feel as if what's happening all around is you're exempt from it, even though I'm Jamaican. And here I have this picture, and this picture is the picture of Ahmaud, and this is me right here. And notice he's wearing his cap and I'm wearing my cap. This was when I was an athlete. And so I enjoyed running, and just seeing somebody else who was doing the exact thing I would be doing at his age. And it hit home as if this was me experiencing what he was experiencing. And it's not just a matter of empathizing with him. I actually felt like I was there in one sense. And then another video came out that showed him going in a house that was empty. And people are saying, see, there's more to the story than that. But that hit home even more, because I have been the curious person who, if I'm walking through a community and I see an empty house, I would sometimes just go and look, not an empty house, but a house that is being constructed. I would actually want to go and look, and I'm thinking, I could have lost my life. And so what's happening is that many African Americans, many Black people are feeling as if this keeps happening, and we are experiencing not just this instance, but it's a build-up of instant after instant after instant. And even though you try not to let it affect you, it really does affect you at a very deep soul level. And that's how I felt.
Right. Thank you, Chris. If you're joining us online, and last time I looked, there's around 300 people. Go ahead, and if you'd like to make a comment. I'm not sure we can resolve all the comments, but this is a discussion, and feel free to chime in. Chris Stupp, you and I are white guys. We're white pastors endeavoring to be relevant in a multi-ethnic context. And you've been around a little while. Tell me, what was your feelings when you first heard it, and then as it unfolded over the last 2 months?
Well, the morning that the video surfaced, or the night that the video surfaced, I'm an early riser. So I'm usually up pretty early in the morning before a lot of people. And I saw this video pop up, and I couldn't even watch it. I mean, I wasn't going to watch it. And every time I just saw, the guy jogging down the street, and it immediately makes your heart sink. Like my heart just, and then and then you have this thought of, here we go again. Like, and then, so I think like that initial shock and sadness. And then I'll be honest with you, it turned into some anger. And I was angry for a couple reasons, because I immediately, the video, of course, was everywhere on social media. Maybe not that early, but it started to become more frequent throughout the day. But even when I went to investigate it in news sites, I was surprised that with some of the major news sites, this thing was buried 10 or 12 stories deep. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, even with coronavirus, this is crazy to me that I'm going looking for this now to see what's going on, and this thing's buried 10 or 12 stories deep. So there became some anger and some frustration, and then that moved into nervousness. And the reason it moved into nervousness was I'm pretty vocal about this. I pastor a multi-ethnic church, and I know that of the people that are my friends that are people of color, and of the people that I pastor that are people of color, often one of the primary concerns is the pastor going to say something about this, or is the pastor going to remain silent? So I knew, I mean, it wasn't just the obligation to say something, it was in my heart to say something. And so I did, and I immediately posted that I was sad, I was angry, and I just posted what my feelings were.
That's great. Juan, Juan brings a little different perspective. Juan's not African American, but Juan is Hispanic and struggles with, or obviously sees how Hispanics would be treated in America. But Juan, when you heard this, did it cause any kind of reaction in you?
To be honest with you, it was more of a sadness that I felt that this was going on again. But it didn't resonate with me personally, because it's maybe because I've see America in a different light, coming from a country where things are worse in many ways, with not racism but classism per se. And so I frame it a little different than a lot of people would. That doesn't mean that everybody should frame it like I would or whatnot, but that's my initial response. If I tell you something else, so that's
Yeah.
pretty much it. I don't even address it in Facebook or even address it at the church, just because I think that we've, at least me not having been here or even born here, I don't have the experience to be able to speak for other people. So that's how I keep it to myself. But I was definitely saddened and upset, and more upset at the fact that this happened again. That's mostly it.
Thank you, Juan. Let me throw a question to the panel then. By the way, if you're watching on Facebook Live, go ahead and drop in a comment. By the way, we're not experts. We're pastors processing out loud this situation. I'm going to throw this question at you. How do you feel should be, quote, the church's response? A forthright response that might be necessarily nuanced according to the context, but I'm not thinking about what should be the government's response, or maybe even what should be your family's response per se. But what pastors, what do you feel would be the appropriate biblical response according to God's word, according to the gospel of Jesus Christ, that this is how a church should respond? And anybody who wants to respond to that first, just jump in.
Pastor, I think of the scripture in Proverbs 31, where it says, speak up for those who have no voice. And I believe that at the minimum, the church, we represent Jesus. We are the hands and feet of Jesus. And so I feel like we have a duty to speak up and to speak out against any matters of injustice, especially because of the climate in which we live, matters of racial injustice. And so I believe that we do have a duty to give voice to those who do not have a voice. And when we look at the Black community at large, it's not that we don't have a voice, but it's that a lot of our community hasn't been a seat at the table to allow their voice to be heard. And so I feel that the church has this responsibility then to be the voice of the voiceless. That to me is just exemplifying the love of Christ.
Awesome.
I want to actually jump in on that. And in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, it says, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. And I think it's important for us as the church to stand with those who are being oppressed. And the African American community has for a long time been oppressed, and many people are saying that, why is it that the African Americans can't just get over it? And I think it's important to understand what has happened. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King was asked this very question: why is it that African Americans don't just snap out of it? And what he said in answer to NBC was that the African Americans were the only race that has been enslaved on the American continent. And while it's important for us to try to pull ourselves up, it is a cruel jest to ask someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't even have a boot. And so we as the church, we need to help those who don't have their boots. We need to be the ones who will speak up. And so while it is easy for us to simply say, that's not our mission, because our mission is the gospel. The gospel is broader than just salvation. The gospel has to do with God empowering people and calling them to himself. And so we need to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. And we need to be the ones who would voice the cries of those who are crying out and say, when is this going to stop?
Right.
I'm reminded of a scripture where Jesus goes to the tomb of Lazarus, and before he could fix the situation, before he even healed the body of Lazarus, he wept. And I think the church's response needs to be a time to actually weep and lament and cry and feel with those that are feeling, and come alongside. I know when my reactions were coming up, I needed the church, and Pastor Tina Davis actually texted me after I posted. If you don't know Pastor Tina, she's a Puerto Rican, Italian, strong woman of God, but she's a good friend of mine, and she actually just said, "How are you doing? I'm here with you." And that was a church response to my heart. It wasn't, was this wrong? It wasn't any, it was, I'm with you. And that feeling of support, not just from her, but from others that came, was a big part. And so I think we follow the example of Jesus and we weep with those that are weeping, and we say, I'm here with you. And after we feel, then Jesus prayed a dynamic prayer and Lazarus came out the tomb. But I think you don't try to fix until you have felt with the people that you're family with and you're walking with.
Right.
I do think you can call it out. I mean, obviously Paul calls this out. He calls it out in Romans with the Gentiles, and in Romans 10 with the Jew Gentile. He calls Peter out when they have the incident at Antioch, and then you have this irony in the book of Acts, where in chapter 10, Peter's the one saying, I understand that God shows no partiality. And obviously this is applicable right now. I think one of the things that I said when I saw this was, am I looking at something from 1865, like 1930? And the fact that it was 2012 and now it's 2020, and it just continues to happen. So this whole thing, like Chris mentioned, why can't people get over it? That was then, this is now argument is not applicable. It's not applicable because this is now, like this is happening now. So I think a biblical response too is to call this out.
Juan, you want to throw in?
Yeah, the way, again, since I wasn't born here in the States, and I lived in Canada and been to many countries in the world, and I see how, in a sense, I don't know, you read when I became an American, July 4th, you commented on that, and I kind of praise America for what it stands and for what it is. And so I have a different point of view, and to be honest with you, I've been a consul for a couple of years, since 2008, and I used to work in Hampton. And I used to see Hispanics who the same thing that is happening to the Black community would be happening to them, but not by whites, by Blacks. So am I to go out and speak against this when Blacks do it to Hispanics? So I gotta keep a balance between what's going on and how I see it, but because the way, at least I encourage the church my church to process it, is that racism is a sin, right? And any type of ism is a sin, legalism is a sin, any type of feminism or machismo, I'm sure you heard the term. So machismo, it ends with an ism, right? That's a sin. And sin is not pride, it's rooted on pride. So that's how I frame it. I also like to check my references, because there's historical facts which some of you mentioned already. There's social media, there's the media out there and stuff like that. So I gotta check my references. Who am I listening to? Just to give you an example, I was talking to my wife, and she's a Polish descent, and her grandmother was in a camp in Germany, and so she has something against Germans unconsciously because of what her grandmother told her. So all these things I gotta filter, and then I gotta reframe it through the Bible. And that's the hardest thing, to love people that have wronged you in the past, or maybe done things to you in the past, or done it to you in the present. So, and then I tend to respond based on that. Because here, I'll tell you my story quickly, because I don't want to take a long time. I used to go to a store, right? And I see this white person, and the white person will give me an attitude, he's racist, or she's racist. And that's not always the case. Maybe that person having a bad day. So what I had to do is reframe that mentality that I came with from another country, to which was mostly based on classism, to hey, maybe things are not going right in with her or with him. How can I pray for that person? That kind of thing. So that's what I encourage the people to do, because I have cases in the church where people were arrested, deported, and whatnot, and I try not to call attention to that so much, but that's the way I see it,
Thank you, Walden.
Pastor, can I add just one more thing, just really quickly? What Chris shared, I think, resonates a ton with me, and I think you and I talked about this the other day. The fact that this, I was talking to one of our other pastor friends, Nigel Anderson, and he had mentioned, and another pastor friend as well, that it felt like a family member passed away, and they were grieving in that sort of intensity. And honestly, I did not feel that sort of grief, but there are many people in our churches who are feeling that amount of grief. And so if you can process as pastors grieving with a family who has had a death in the family, how would you respond to that? And maybe that would help you figure out, without trying to get political and all these other things, process that someone in your church, their family member, passed away. Compound that with corona and discrimination and everything like that, but process it that way. That's how I felt, or how these others felt, and I needed to come alongside people in that way and say, I'm going to help you grieve this death of a quote unquote family member. So that was something that I felt could be helpful for church leaders.
Yeah, I think all of us that are on this journey, and those that are tuning in here on Facebook, it seems to me that a light bulb, if you're not African American and you're not raised in the African American narrative, where somebody who had an injustice that happened to you, and there's a constant threat that you sense and feel that's real. If you're not in that environment and you're raised in a different culture, different part of the nation, it's almost as if God has to open your eyes. And once you've opened your eyes, you can never go back. It's kind of like you see it, you get it. And I use the word empathize, but it's even more than empathize. I think there's a point of revelation. And one thing that and I had to be slow as a white pastor to speak on behalf of anybody. I got to be really careful not to inject myself where I'm not qualified or whatever. But there is a historical wound in the African American community because of slavery and how they were viewed. And now I know the laws have changed, right? Civil rights has come, right? We're in a different world, but that community wound is still real. It's still real. And as pastors, we have to recognize that wound, and how you address it is through empathy, passion, conversation. Don't dismiss it. Don't say get over it. Don't say, well, I had something go bad with me too. Because what it does is there's one, on one side as a pastor, we put everybody in the same basket. God's not a respecter of persons. On the other hand, as pastors, we also have to know that journeys are different. For example, going back to Juan's comment, if we had a lot of people in our church that had been in Auschwitz, we would have some real issues of forgiveness, and we would be very careful how we said and did things, because even though the war is over, the wound remains. And sometimes in America, I'm not saying the war is over, but the laws have changed, but yet the wound remains. And so as pastors, we have to, in my view anyway, we have to be able to be discerning, empathetic. We have to, I think, come alongside. It's interesting, how meaningful it is for David when he's processing Ahmaud. He gets a call from another leader who's not Black. That says something. It says, I'm with you. Although I'm not Black, I'm with you. I'm with you as you're processing this. And it's not a statement of, I think we just, when people just want to, I've heard this, we don't believe in activism, we believe in factivism. I get it. Facts are for the courtroom. You got to have the facts. However, in something like this thing with Ahmaud, there are the general facts that are enough because it elicits such a response. Let me give you an example. You remember when O.J. Simpson was found innocent? How the Black community, the white community both reacted completely opposite, and they both saw the exact same facts. They saw the exact same facts, but their journeys were so different that they viewed the exact same facts and came to different conclusions. A little bit of that keeps us humble. Like, I may not see this exactly the same way, but I need to identify that this other group of people are seeing it differently, and I should come alongside and try to feel what they feel, not make a judgment, not be quick to dismiss, and once that light bulb goes on, there's no going back. That's the thing about this racial discussion. There's no going back. Once you see it, it's like you see it now. It's like you got the glasses that see color. You see it, and you can't go back. I want to talk to you. I'm going to throw the sixth question out. What are some practical things that you think the church could do? Literally, do these things to help process this event, but more than this, just the racial event. How can we? And I have a couple things that our church has done, but there's so many things that we can do and things we maybe shouldn't do. So let me throw that out there. What are some practical things churches can do to respond?
I want to start with that because one of the things about Jesus is that Jesus lived among the people. He didn't stay from afar. And one thing for us to be able to understand is that we don't understand everything. And so if you don't understand everything, ask, because the experience you have might be very different from what somebody else has in the same situation. And I'll give you an example with me. I remember the first time I was stopped by a policeman on the road. I have a 95% obedience rate with the speed limits. I do all that I'm doing. So I'm at the stoplight, and as soon as the light changes and I cross the road, a police turned on his lights behind me. And so the first thing I did, I put my hands on the steering wheel. I made sure I wound my window down. I made sure that there was enough light in the car. And then he came to me and he asked license and registration. And before I answered him, I said, my registration is in the glove compartment. May I reach for it? And he said, yes. And as I was reaching for it, I felt my hands begin to shake. And the reason that was happening is not because I thought I had done something major wrong. All I had was a broken taillight, and he was going to give me a warning to go and get it fixed. But what happened is that I had the baggage of years of seeing on TV African Americans in a simple stop being killed. and how things turned. And I wondered if my white brother would tremble as he's holding the steering wheel, if he would ask for permission to reach for the glove compartment. And so even though we go through the same experiences, we experience it differently. And many African Americans are coming from it with the baggage of the past, that they have seen it and they've felt what others have gone through. So the practical thing to do with this is to listen, to talk, to have discussions. Invite a Black person over to dinner after the quarantine is over. But we need to listen to people and ask them, how do you feel about this? How do you shape this discussion? Why do you react this way to it? Because even though we might experience the same things, we experience it from a different perspective.
I love that, Pastor Chris. I think, to add to that, we've all heard the term, paralysis by analysis. And I think that is something, unfortunately, that has been plaguing the church, where a lot of churches feel like, well, there's so much, that we could say. We don't want to offend this group. We don't want to offend that group. So they allow themselves to become paralyzed. And instead of saying something, they say nothing. And I feel that that is a great disservice, not only to the Black community, but to the church. I think when I'm looking at the news and the world is responding quicker than the church, the world is taking these matters into their hands and they're coming up with these initiatives and programs. And I'm thinking, Jesus, you're the one who said in your word in 2 Corinthians that we are the ones that are supposed to be ministers of reconciliation. We, the church, that's our gift, that we're supposed to be ministers of reconciliation. So why are we paralyzed? Why are we stuck in not knowing what to do? And I think that the solutions are a lot simpler than we sometimes make them out to be. I definitely think that we need to have these conversations. I believe that there's the church at large, our congregations want to have these conversations and they need leaders to be able to step up and say, this is how you do it. No, we're not experts, but you don't have to be an expert. Everyone has a story. And if we approach these conversations with empathy, but also with humility on both sides, for our white brothers and sisters that say, we don't know what we don't know. Can you help us to know what we should know? And then for our Black brothers and sisters to say, we're going to approach this humbly as well. We're not going to be easily offended. As easy as it is to be offended, we are going to try to live open-heartedly. That, I believe, is how the church leads. And that's when the world will then look at us and say, wow, that's what unity really looks like. And I think it's obviously it's the enemy who wants to come and try to continue to divide and who wants to try to keep us on our other side of the fence and, do what I call Christian kumbaya, which is let's just pray and move on. But prayer is not passive. Prayer requires, and that's why, again, I love that scripture that says, do justice. Another translation says, act justly, seek justice. Those are all action verbs. And so we can't just say we want to be people who appreciate justice or believe in justice, but we need to be people who act and who respond justly when we see things like this happen.
Excellent.
Totally. Yeah, totally agree with that. I think the prayer first and foremost, but what happens is what Dana said is if we don't take ownership of this and we just say, hey, pray, and then it's like, well, that person just needs healing. Oh, well, let the prayer team deal with that, or a healing ministry or a healing class, or that person just needs to get set free from this. But there's no conversation taking place. I told Nikki the other day, I told my wife the other day, I said, the bottom line is that I walk in white privilege, and my reality, like what Chris was talking about, my reality is different. The experiences may be the same, but my reality is different. And I need to be okay with saying I walk in white privilege. And that is going to bother a lot of my white friends or white congregants. But that's part of the conversation. Because really what this boils down to, where it goes so against the gospel, is the simple inferiority versus superiority. And that's where it's like, it goes so against the gospel. So yeah, I completely agree with what Chris and Dana both said.
Awesome.
You want to go first? I can go right after.
David, go ahead, brother. Go ahead, jump in.
I was talking to a professor at Regent University, who's an elder at our church, Diane Chandler, and she had some great thoughts that I think would be helpful to churches. One was to give the congregation insight into what different cultures are experiencing by maybe having a panel of African Americans share. They can share with you on a Sunday morning. They can share with you on a Zoom call, but let them share so that the church, maybe if your church isn't multi-ethnic yet, your church can hear that perspective. And I think that could be really helpful. And I even would go as far as saying, allow other cultures to have that sort of an avenue to share as well. I don't know what all my white brothers are thinking. I don't know what all my Hispanic brothers are thinking. And so to be able to hear that, and if you don't have a multi-ethnic church, maybe you invite a panel of people that can help you figure that out. I think the other thing that would be helpful, the reason why this would be helpful as well, even in a multi-ethnic church or those aspiring to be one, is we are in a challenge of actually being a multi-ethnic church versus being a multicolored church, meaning a church that has different ethnicities who come to the service and then leave going to their own cars and still are separate. And New Life is struggling this in some ways. And so the ability to be able to allow the folks that don't have deep relationships, that still worship together but don't have deep relationships, can hear. I benefit from being on a multi-ethnic staff where I'm hearing the conversations, but these folks I do life with, being able to hear the perspectives of people, because we'll sometimes we talk one way at church and talk another way when we get home. And so to be able to hear some of those living room conversations and say, it's okay for us to hear this because we want to know how you're actually doing and what the Lord is saying to you in that process. I think it's super important that we challenge people to say, this is what you're feeling, and that's okay. But now what's the Lord saying to those feelings, and how do we walk together as disciples of Christ?
Right. You know, one of the things that I believe that we don't want to gloss over is that the church does have weapons that are not carnal.
Yeah.
And we could say, and I know Chris did not imply this at all. We could say, well, you can pray, but I'll just, all you people that want to pray. Well, let's back up. If you really pray about this, you'll get the heart of God for this. And God will give you the right response to this. Second of all, if you get people of different ethnicities together to worship, to pray, to listen to the word of God together, even though you're not addressing this issue head on yet, you are creating a common spirituality of sorts that does have a benefit. And I'm thinking, like in New Life and all of our churches, we may not be able to solve the world's problems, but we can start solving the corner of our world. And that is our church and our family and our family's friends, working on, allowing the gospel to move in justice and in just our own circles. And I think sometimes the church forgets we've got a lot to bring to the table that a politician doesn't have, or a community leader might not have, because we have the full gospel. And well, a quick thing happens. I've been on this journey 25 years, and I don't want to relive it all with you because some of you are, know a little bit about it. Anyway, this summer, right, I'm at a family function, and I meet a new member of our family. One of my, I won't say who, one of my family, not my immediate family, one of my extended family got married, and he's a fine guy. And we're watching a sporting event with a whole bunch of men in the room. And he made a racial thing. I froze. I'm not in church. In church, I know what to do. In church, I know what to say. In church, I would have a platform as the pastor to address this. I'm now in a living room with 15 other football watchers, and this guy just wasn't a totally racist remark. It was like a on the edge thing, and I'm going, should I say something? I got to speak up? Hey, I thought, I got to get out of the cocoon. I mean, I live in a cocoon in the church, and how we can train our people and equip our people to be salt and light in in a crazy world out there. And last thing I want to say is, one of the dangers you have is you put every white man in the same category. Not all white people are equally racist. And you can't put all black people in the same category. Or for that matter, every Hispanic. We have to be discerning not to lump everybody's journey and everybody's thoughts and just broad stroke the whole thing. In this thing with Arbery, I think we can come together though, in a pretty broad way and say, we don't need to know the details. This was an injustice, and it speaks. You know what speaks the most to me as a church? Why did it take 2 months to have anybody charged? It's because the video got out. The cops had the video and they don't do anything with it. Every libertarian in America that believes in justice ought to be screaming, because that could happen to any one of us. Juan, do you want to throw something out there about how you think the church might respond practically?
On a practical level, what I personally encourage people to do in our church, because our church is the biggest group actually in the church is blacks, Dominican blacks. So you got this ethnicity and you got this color thing going on in the church. So there's obviously differences in Nueva Vida in resistance to connecting to people, even at that level, even if we all are Hispanic. So we have differences, right? And so and then you have people of different backgrounds of gang members and stuff like that, or even witchcraft backgrounds in the church. So I try to at least connect with people, even if it makes, first I recognize the uncomfort and I call it out in the church. And then I connect with them because it's hard to do. When something's uncomfortable, it creates fear in our head. And so we approach it with fear, and people can sense fear, and people can sense when you're fake. And that's on a practical level, what I encourage people to do is, have friends of different backgrounds, whether and not just Hispanics, and because we have different backgrounds, and so that's what I encourage people to do in the church.
Thank you. It's already 12:51. We've been talking for 50 minutes. I wish we could talk for 2 hours, but we do have 10 minutes left. I want to give each of you a couple of minutes to make a final charge to those that are, we got about 300 people online. By this time tomorrow, there'll be 1,200. And by this time next week, there'll be 2,500 people that will tune in. And you have a chance to say something as a pastor to people that you love. And we all love America. We love people. We love our church. We're bridge builders, peacemakers. We're prophetic. We're going to call out injustice. We're also going to give mercy. So I'm going to give each of you one last shot, and then we're going to close this down today. And again, thank you for being here. Oh, there's a ton of good comments today. I hope our moderators are following along and can respond to so many of these good comments. So David, I want to start with you. You've got 2 minutes to leave a charge with people that are watching today. What would you say?
Can you hear me? Okay. I think the first thing that I would say, and it's a New Life Church ethos, is that we need to pray. I think that goes without saying. I think that thinking that we're already prayed up might be a little bit of might not be prayed up. And I think we need to pray, but I think a practical step right after that is to make sure that each of you use your voice. Pray and then use your voice, whether it's on social media, whether it's you have a small circle. Use your voice in your circle. Use your voice in your influence, and make sure your voice is heard. No matter what color you are, no matter what ethnicity you are, use your voice and make sure your voice is heard. Pray first, but make sure your voice is heard so that people can know, one, that you care, but also that we can confront evil. And I just encourage each of you, be courageous in your voice. Be courageous in your voice, because your voice as a Christian, just think about this, you're a spirit-filled, hopefully spirit-filled Christian. Let that spirit that's in you touch someone and destroy the works of the evil one in our world.
Thanks, David. Chris Cunningham, what would you say?
I like to look at the big picture, but right now I want to just narrow it down to the individual. And what I would suggest is for every one of us to examine ourselves, because it might not be in our minds to be racist, but we have some practices that perpetuate the wrong, and we might not realize that we have those practices. And a quick story is a woman was baking a ham and she would cut off the ends of the ham, and someone asked her, why do you cut off the ends of the ham? And she said, I don't know, I cut it off because my mom cut off the ends of her ham. And so they went to the mom and asked, why do you cut off the ends of the ham? And because my mother did it. So they went back and they traced it, and they realized that the reason the great grandmother cut off the ends of the ham was that she had a pan that was too small for the ham. And so she would cut off the ends before she put it in the oven. And so sometimes some of the things we do them not because we want to be racist, not because we want to be prejudiced, but we do them because that's how society has caused us to act. And we don't even realize that some of the things we do have racist background. So the practical step I would suggest is for every Black person, every white person, every Hispanic person to look at the things you do and ask yourself the question, am I perpetuating something that I don't want to perpetuate? And go before the Lord and say, God, I recognize that I'm not doing this right, but forgive me and help me to be better. So I just want to bring it, as we're closing, to the individual level. We all have issues that we need to deal with. Look at it.
Hey, Chris, I'm gonna make a quick comment. You know, I'm from South Dakota and I got pulled over a few times. You know what the protocol was in South Dakota if you got pulled over? You get out of your car and you go shake the hand of the police officer. I never have ever thought about putting my hands on the steering wheel. When the cop comes to my door, and I don't care if the cop's black, white, Hispanic, woman, male, I don't care. I'm digging through my glove boxes. I don't know where I stuck my registration. It's in there somewhere. I never think about it. So to your point, you see how I brought this forward, and an African American brings something else forward, and we never stop back to look at each other's stories and say, why is Chris Cunningham trembling and I'm not? Now, Chris Stupp might call that white privilege. I might call that my journey is different. I was always raised that police officers were on our side. And, you know, and I was always against anybody that was anti, you know, the justices. And I'm seeing now that not every apple in the apple cart is a good apple. And you have to call out the bad apples. And thank you, Chris, for saying that. Dana, what would you like to say?
I would just like to encourage everybody to lean into the uncomfortable conversations. I love Jillian Michaels. I work out with her. And one of her phrases is, you've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I find myself saying that all the time. Someone messaged me on Facebook last night and she was saying, you know, she was feeling some guilt because she's white and she hadn't spoken out. And she was like, should I have? And I'm like, I can't tell you what you should do. You need to go before the Lord with that. But I said, let me answer your question with a question. If everyone else wasn't posting, would you? That was the first one. And the second question is, why do you feel guilty? So I wanted her to sit into that uncomfortability. I don't want to give her the answers. And, you know, it's just like lifting weights. You know, if I'm lifting 5-pound dumbbells, I can be like, I'm lifting, I'm doing my thing. I could post my pictures on Instagram. I'm lifting, I'm working out. But the truth of the matter is 5 pounds is not making me uncomfortable. And therefore I am not growing. My muscles are not being torn down and therefore they're not growing. It's until I pick up the 50-pound dumbbells and I feel like this hurts. I don't want to do this anymore. My muscles are trembling, but it's in that uncomfortability that I'm then beginning to build. I'm beginning to grow. And so I know for me, if all of my friends, if we're just having these safe and shallow conversations, that's nice. It'll make me feel good, but it's not actually making me grow. So I think that my encouragement would be to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. When you're in these uncomfortable spaces and in uncomfortable situations, don't back away from those, lean into those. And then finally, you know, I think if we just go back to the word of God, you know, Micah 6:8, one of my favorite scriptures, I want to read it, but it says, mankind, he has told each of you what is good and what it is that the Lord requires of you. And then he says, one thing is to act justly. And there's that action word again, act justly, seek justice, love mercy, and then walk humbly with your God. And I think if we can keep that in our view, that we are going to seek justice, all of us, we are going to love mercy, and we are going to walk humbly with our God, then as these things come up, we don't have to shift our focus and say, what should we do? Because we're already doing it. We're already seeking justice. We're already being merciful, and we're always walking humbly with our God.
Thanks, Dane. That's awesome. Juan, what's your final charge?
Kind of wanted to piggyback on what you said earlier, and that's something I try to keep my heart from doing, is identifying a group of people based on what somebody did, and that's happened to me quite a few times, and that's something I would encourage people to keep track of their thoughts, and if they have to be reframed, to reframe them based on the Word of God. I mean, it's challenging to love people that think differently, even just a slight difference that there is. It would be hard and it's challenging, and when you have people that think very different from you, it's even harder, whether it be lifestyles or whatnot. And so I would encourage us to, which is hard to do, to love one another the way God loves us, and it's hard to not single out a group just for what somebody did. And you know, this conversation has been really helpful. I gotta say this, at least to me, being able to hear other perspectives and the feelings behind David, Chris, and Dana. I mean, that's just, thank you guys for teaching me more about what it means to be Black here in America. And I know the history, some of it, obviously not all of it. I wasn't raised here, but just being able to see your expressions and to hear your heart, that's been really a teaching moment for me. Obviously, I have perspectives and differences, and I get that, but that's what I would say.
Thank you, Juan. You're a quality guy. Chris, up.
I think prayer first and foremost, and I love, Dan, when you said worship with people that are different from you, pray with people that are different from you. I love hearing our African-American congregants pray, because you get to hear their heart. So when other people are praying, just listen to them. So prayer first and foremost, relationship building. And the church should be the leading voice here. We should have the prophetic edge. We should be the prophetic voice. We should be the one paving the way. So having these difficult conversations is going to enable us to do that. Realize that Jesus is the way out of this mess. You know, read Ephesians 2, read 2 Corinthians 5, realize that we have to be reconciled to God in order for this to happen, and that Jesus was the one that did that. You know, read Acts chapter 15, give credit to the early church for paving the way. All those ethnic distinctions and complexities and all that stuff, all still within the framework of the gospel. That's Acts chapter 15. Even the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, that's the church paving the way. That's the early church paving the way. And realize that when we read in the book of Revelation, that there's going to be this multitude of every tribe and every tongue, that yes, we're of one spirit, but we're not all the same skin color. So I think it's important to keep all of those things in mind. Thank you for including me in this conversation.
Oh, you're welcome, brother. Awesome. You guys are fantastic. Well, one final thought, and then we're going to close out. Grace is not juxtaposed to justice. You can be a grace person and be a justice person. I would argue you can't be a person of grace if you're not also a person of justice. And I think we as the church can talk grace and reconciliation to God and so forth, and we can see the justice issue as a hot potato. So to Dana's point, let's pick up 50 pounds of hot potatoes today. And let's become better leaders. And those of you that joined us today on Facebook Live, thank you for joining in. I've been following the comments, so insightful. Thanks for doing that. This will not be the last time we talk about this. We're all on this journey, and I think I've been reawakened. I have a voice. I think I need to use it more, David. I think I need to use my voice more often. I need to be more reflective, more courageous. And I want to help raise up a whole nother generation of prophets. And final thing is, let's don't do it the old way. Let's don't do it the old way. Let's do it a new way, a kingdom way. Leading by intercession, leading by loving our neighbor, being fully biblical, devout followers of Christ, and let's pray for a revival. Well, thank you for joining me. It's a little after 1 o'clock. I'm going to sign off now, and I want to thank our panelists today. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Chris Stupp. Thank you, Chris Cunningham. Thanks, Juan Mila. Thanks, Pastor David. I'm a better pastor because of you. So God bless you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. See you tomorrow at noon. Bye-bye.